Hello, welcome back to The Professor Speaks. I'm Rafael Chacón, Director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture in Missoula, Montana, in the Western United States. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to our series on Roman and early Christian art. We're in our seventh lecture, about halfway through a discussion of this amazing course of the Roman Empire, one of the most formidable empires to rule in the Western world. And today we're going to do something a little bit interesting. We're going to take a sidebar and discuss aspects of Roman life, which were very important. We're going to look at architecture and urbanism, particularly domestic architecture. So we're going to look at a number of villas, particularly in the Bay of Naples. So that's the topic of discussion for today. So bear with me as I turn on my presentation here, my PowerPoint presentation, and we will begin shortly. So as I mentioned, this is the seventh lecture, and we are taking a pause from the long slog of Roman emperors to discuss a very important aspect of life in the Roman world, and that is the domestic life. That is the way the Romans lived, particularly the upper classes, because we have quite a wonderful archaeological record of their lives. And of course, archaeologists primarily in the 19th and 20th centuries focused on the elites in the society and excavating monuments, villas, important places that that compose the life of the upper classes, the patrician families that ruled the Roman Empire. And that happened, by the way, not just in Rome proper, but also in outlying areas of the Italian peninsula, as well as all parts of the vast Roman Empire. So today we're going to focus on the Bay of Naples. And we know from the ancient Greek author Strabo, who wrote in the 1st century BC, that the Bay of Naples, from Misenum in the north to Sorrento, or Surrentum in the south, was entirely laid out with towns and villas and gardens in an unbroken line, giving the appearance of a single city. And if you've ever driven down that coast today, that is still true today, some over 2,000 years later. There is, in fact, a continuous urban presence all along that essential coast, that important coast on the western side of the Italian peninsula. So our story related to these villas, particularly in the Bay of Naples, really begins on August 24th, the year 79. And of course, this is during the rule of the Flavian emperors. According to Roman military commander and a man of letters by the name of Pliny the Elder, most of the villas on the Bay of Naples, that is south of Mount Vesuvius, were destroyed by a massive volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And that took place on August 24th, 79. The two most famous towns that were destroyed in that explosion, or essentially covered by the volcanic ash, were the towns of Herculaneum and Pompeii, both of which were excavated in the 18th century, or begun to be excavated in the 18th century. Pliny recorded that from a boat sitting in the harbor, he noticed this explosion and actually left an account of that massive explosion, which is now celebrated in human history. Pliny the Younger, his nephew, wrote, "I can best describe its shape by likening it to a pine tree. It rose into the sky in a very long trunk from which spread some of its branches. I imagine it had been raised by a sudden blast, which then weakened, leaving the cloud unsupported so that its own weight caused it to spread sideways." So this dramatic firsthand account, actually, Pliny the Younger actually wrote down the account of his uncle's actual firsthand viewing of this volcanic eruption, is pretty powerful. And it's been used, of course, by volcanologists and many others who study volcanic explosions ever since. And this is an artist's rendering of what that explosion may have looked like. The reference, by the way, to the pine tree is the famous Roman pine, which grows very tall as a column and then branches out. And that's apparently what this plume looked like in that explosion. And here's another 19th century view of the city of Pompeii, now excavated in the 19th century, unearthed from the ash that once covered it, with Mount Vesuvius in the distance. And here's the wonderful painting by the Russian artist Karl Brulov, who painted this in the early 19th century when there was a feverish activity at the archaeological site and all kinds of interest among historians and archaeologists and amateurs and dramatists too, because this captured the cultural imagination as well, as Pompeii was being unearthed in the early 19th century. This is a marvelous historicist image of the events that took place in Pompeii in the 1st century AD. And this is what the site looks like today. Much of the city, of course, the superstructure of the city is gone. And by the way, you have to ignore that, that modern church building there in the upper left. What you're looking at in the foreground are actually the ruins of the city of Pompeii. The superstructure of these buildings all collapsed under the weight of the ash that landed, the ash and the stone and the pumice that landed on top of the roofs. Many of those roofs caught fire. But what we do have is the lower structures and the floor level of that city, and that has been almost entirely excavated in modern times. Here, for example, on the left is an image of a typical street scene in Pompeii with its original paving stones, its sidewalks. The stones that you see in the middle were not deterrents for carts. They were actually so people could cross over, skipping over the worst parts of the streets, because the streets were actually quite filthy in ancient days. And then on the right, you have the most impressive find in Pompeii, and that's actually its victims. And there are hundreds of individuals who took shelter, who could not flee the city, who were in fact left behind. Many of them, by the way, had left the city days before because there were inclinations that, that the volcano would in fact release. And so many Pompeians fled, particularly after the water service, the aqueducts ceased to function. The city became dry, and so many of the wealthy Romans who lived in Pompeii, who vacationed there, so to speak, fled the city by land, and many others, still many others by boat, by sea. So they just headed north along the coast back to the imperial capital. But on the right, we have these incredible casts, and these were the impressions left by the bodies of individuals who died in Pompeii. And these are air pockets essentially in the ash, which were then filled with plaster and then excavated, or that is released from the ash, giving us a positive impression of what these individuals look like. And this is perhaps the most impressive aspect of Pompeii. We can see people in their last moments, just before their actual deaths in this city. So these are impressive images of adults and children, families taking shelter, hoping to survive the volcanic blast, but obviously not succeeding. Here are some more of those plaster casts. These were, by the way, all done by Giuseppe Fiorelli, a 19th century archaeologist who discovered that you could actually invest these air pockets and whatever remains were there with plaster. And then once you carved out the ash from around them, you would have a positive image of those individuals. And these are very poignant objects, obviously, and testaments to the anguish that these people suffered in their last moments. Here's another one. You can actually see parts of a cranium of an individual who succumbed to the volcanic eruption in 79 AD. Now, I mentioned that the city is mostly excavated, and I'm showing you two different maps here that show you that the city, and it's probably the one on the right that is most clear. Pompeii has been divided into these neighborhoods. They're known as regios in Italian, and most of those have indeed been excavated, as you can see in the diagram on the lower right. There are regions, particularly Regio 5, that you see up there in the north, which is northeastern side of the city, which is unexcavated, and those are currently being excavated today with some spectacular finds taking place as we speak. Among those finds is an inscription that actually changes the date of the eruption. It says there's an inscription that says 16 days before the calends of November, placing the eruption at October 17th, 79, replacing Pliny's August 24th. Now, it's entirely possible that Pliny got it wrong, because remember, he's writing from his uncle's accounts much later in time. Their memories could have been faulty. This inscription seems to prove that the eruption took place on October 17th 79. Here is indeed that inscription that you can see it. So we don't really know for sure whether it was in August or October, but the scholarship seems to be leaning towards the October 17th date. So for the purpose of understanding the development of the villas along the coast, there are some other important dates. For example, we know that on April 30th, 89 BCE, so the volcanic eruption happened in 79 AD, and that is the terminus, the end of the villas and the buildings that we're going to analyze shortly. That's the end point for these villas. The beginning point is also very clear to us. April 30th, 89, Lucius Cornelius Sulla destroyed Stabia, the town of Stabia, and ravaged the coast in what is now known as the Social War. So the Romans took control of this region as late as 89 BC. So really we have a century in which this coastline was developed with all these fabulous villas, these patrician villas from Rome. And those are the buildings that I want to focus on now. And we know that Rome's political elite, beginning with 89 BC, all the way up to 79 AD, were in fact building, rebuilding, reconstructing villas. And those individuals included people like Caesar Augustus, Cicero, Julius Caesar, Crassus, Lucullus, Sulla himself, and Tiberius, Emperor Tiberius, also had villas, as we've noted, on the Bay of Naples. And here is indeed the Bay of Naples, the city of the ancient Greek city of Neapolis, which is now known as Naples, there in the north, and then the towns of Herculaneum, Torre del Greco, and Pompeii to the right. And these are all towns which, in fact, were destroyed by Mount Vesuvius's eruption. But just remember Strabo's comment that that entire coastline was dotted with ancient homes, ancient imperial Roman homes. And those are the ones that we want to focus on today. Some elite homes, at least 50 of them, if not many more. And these were not just pleasure domes or second homes, if you will, vacation palaces for these wealthy Romans who, of course, fled the heat and the humidity of Rome in the summers to the more favorable weather of the coast. But they were also working estates. So they had agricultural land surrounding them that produced all kinds of goods that the Romans needed to enjoy the coast itself. So I just want to show you this marvelous diagram. This is a map showing you the extent of the volcanic explosion and the reach of the ash, the volcanic ash that darkened the sky as if it were night, according to Pliny the Elder and Younger. There is Mount Vesuvius there in the upper left, and then its explosion, it moved primarily to the southeast, covering, of course, Pompeii, cities like Oplontis, Herculaneum, Stabia itself, all the way down to the Sorrento and Positano, some of the sites on that peninsula that you see there below. Capri Island was spared of the ash from the volcanic eruption. Okay, now Herculaneum was the first city that was actually excavated. It was discovered in 1709, and then the excavations began in 1738. So really, Herculaneum led the way in creating a kind of frenzy among Europeans and interest in ancient Rome. And here you have an image of a wonderful portrait of the Bourbon king of Spain. His name was Charles. He was, of course, of French heritage, but nevertheless ruled both Naples, which was a Spanish territory at the time, and most of southern Italy was. In fact, Spain was the longest ruling empire in the Italian peninsula in its history. And Charles of Bourbon was the man who actually commissioned the excavation of Herculaneum, and then, of course, Pompeii in 1748, so a decade later. These were terrific and important time capsules that were excavated under his rule, and really created a high degree of interest in the Roman Empire all over the Western world. Other places like Stabia, for example, were also excavated, and those excavations began in 1749, led by the Spaniard Roque Joaquín de Alcubierre and the Swiss engineer Carl Weber. So this is an image of those excavations. This was actually in 1776. This is an Italian artist's rendering of the excavations of Pompeii. In fact, this is an important temple at the heart of the ancient city of Pompeii, the Temple of Isis. And if you remember, the Romans, of course, had adopted gods, including the Egyptian goddess Isis, and there was a major temple to Pompeii, or to Isis, at the heart of the city of Pompeii. But what I want to focus on is the housing, and there's some marvelous examples of urban housing in Pompeii and Herculaneum. This is, for example, a home known as the Domus Italica type. And this is probably an ancient housing type. The Romans just continued it. They didn't invent it, they continued it. But this is an aristocratic and upper class home in the city of Pompeii, which was, by the way, very, very densely urbanized. So what you see is a typical plan of a house, and this is known as the House of the Tragic Poet. It takes its name, by the way, the name was given to it in the 18th century from the fresco, the little painting that you see there on the left, of an individual who looks to be a poet ruminating as he writes his poetry. But it gives you a sense of what a typical urban household was like. Houses were packed together in a kind of urban landscape, a landscape that we would find familiar today. And let me just show you what that house looks like in detail. This is the entrance to the house, and notice that there's this marvelous mosaic on the floor. Right at the doorway, there was an image of a dog chained to the door, and this is the famous Cave Canem mosaic, because it shows us a ferocious dog chained there to guard the doorway to the house, to guard the ostium, or the janua, the hallway that led you into the house of the tragic poet properly. Left and right of that, as you can see on the diagram on the right, were two tabernae, two businesses, essentially two restaurants that were located on the floor, and they had nothing to do with the house proper. The house was actually beyond this hallway in the center, and what you see here in the upper right-hand side. And here's a cutout, a diagram of that house. So the hallway that we were just standing in is right here, and then you see, in fact, the courtyards and the rooms of the house surrounding it. And here is, in fact, one of those taberna, one of those restaurants on this side, on the left side of the entry, and there would have been another one in the foreground on the right side, except this image has been cut in half, so you can actually see a cross-section of the house itself. There were second stories. There was a second story to the house as well in the front part of on the street side, if you will, of the house of the tragic poet, with rooms up there as well, mostly sleeping quarters. And one other important thing to note here is that the house really surrounds a series of internal courtyards. So what we have is, in fact, outdoor spaces inside the house. And so think of Pompeii as a kind of fortress-like composition, where most of the housing had high exterior, solid walls and windows and doors facing the street. But then the house turned in the interior on these courtyards that allowed fresh air and rain and birds and plants to thrive inside the house proper. And that's a pattern we see throughout the Mediterranean that has continued beyond Roman times. And by the way, it's a pattern that has also been brought to the New World, to the Americas, by later colonizers. So I want to show you three incredible sites, though, where we're going to focus on rural villas. So these are not villas in the cities like what we see in Herculaneum and Pompeii, but these are, in fact, the villas of Roman elites out in the countryside, particularly along the edges of the sea, along the bay itself. So we're going to look at three different cities. First, the city of Stabia, and then Oplontis, and then Bosco Reale. And then in those cities, or those roughly cities, and actually they're not cities, they're towns, they're modern towns, and there were ancient towns, and then alongside those towns, or near those towns, is where we find these marvelous rural or maritime villas, as the Romans referred to them. So we'll look at two near Stabia, and then one at Oplontis, and then a few others at Bosco Reale. And then we'll also visit the museum there at Bosco Reale, which has many remains from these rural maritime villas. And this is what the landscape looks like today. So we have these volcanic mountains all around, beautiful orchards. It is, in fact, a very, very fertile and a beautiful area of Italy today. And that fertility comes from those volcanic eruptions, ancient volcanic eruptions that made the soil itself so rich for vegetation and agriculture. There is one important detail, though. The ground that we're actually looking at here is in some cases 30 feet higher than it was in the time of the eruption in that first century AD. And that is because of the volcanic ash and pumice that was actually deposited on those ancient sites. So what we're standing on today, as you see here in this image, is actually some 30 feet above the ground level. And that, of course, varies depending on where the wind blew the ash and where it landed and settled. But just know that this is, in fact, a modern ground firmament that we walk on rather than the ancient floor level. Here are some of the beautiful gardens that you tend to see. And again, that soil is fabulously rich and filled with nutrients that come from underground and that came from the volcanic eruption proper. This is a really interesting hill, and both of these images show you a series of villas here near Stabia, and it's a marvelous image of the urban development of this area. You see in the image in the upper left, you see the dense housing that exists there today. This is the modern city. It's proper with the modern shoreline. And then you'll see this ridge running along the left side of the image with all these pinpoints on it. These pinpoints actually mark the ancient villas. And this is actually the ancient cliff that overlooked the ocean back at the time of the first century AD. These were the villas that were excavated in the mid-18th century and into the 19th century, before, in some cases before Pompeii was excavated. So imagine that these cities were actually overlooking the sea proper, with the beach being right here below those cliffs. Today, that of course is that ground shifted, has completely changed. Some 2,000 years later, it's been completely built over, and the sea itself receded. The Bay of Naples actually receded substantially because of that ash fall in 79 AD. And the image on the right shows us a number of the villas, and some of these we're going to visit: the Villa of Hercules, the Villa of San Marco, the Villa del Pastore, Villa Arianna, some of the villas that mark this remarkable site. And these were, some of them were excavated in the 18th, some in the 19th century, and some in the 20th century. Many of them are still, by the way, unexcavated today, even though they form an archaeological park for the Italian state. Here is a view, some Google images of the view from above. There is Stabia, the region of Stabia, the town of Castellammare di Stabia. And here, that dark line that you see of trees is the cliff upon which sat the ancient Roman villas. This was all underwater in ancient days. And then again, a detail of that cliff, the now treed cliff wall, and imagine the ocean being right here to the west, below at the feet, if you will, of those villas, those elite villas. And here's a view from one of those villas looking out. And imagine that all the housing that you see there today was not there, but the ocean was right there. It's an amazing, amazing view. The first villa we're going to look at is known as the Villa of Arianna, and this was excavated in the mid 18th century, 1 year after the discovery of Pompeii, and then it was revisited in 1881 by Ruggiero, the archaeologist Ruggiero, and then in 1950 by Dorsi, and Elia. And we know that this villa was built in the Augustan period, so it's actually in the first century AD when it was built. It's an amazing place, and then it was expanded during the age of Claudius in the first century AD. It has a number of very important rooms, beautifully appointed rooms. It was a very large, extensive villa, but it has one really amazing feature, and that's the detail that you see there in color in the lower left. And that is a kind of a basin, a water basin, a water feature, if you will, an ancient piscina or pool that overlooked the ocean. So imagine this kind of reflective pool overlooking the cliff and then the ocean beyond, and that's what we see there today. So this is how you enter the house today, and you have to descend to the house. You have to get down to the original level. So the current height of the ground is up here, but in antiquity it was down here. And this is, of course, all modern, or this is all the ash from Vesuvius that covered it. And this is the ancient doorway to the house. The plaster on the walls, on the stone walls, is now mostly gone, except down at the base. And actually, we want to go forward here on the PowerPoint. And this is the first room you encounter. And this room actually is an important atrium in the house. And again, remember, these houses had very solid defensive walls, if you will, to protect the exterior of the house. The house turned on these internal courtyards. And this is the first room that you encounter when you walked into the villa. It allowed rain to fall, to birds to fly in, plants to grow in here, because natural light and air, of course, penetrated the roof of the house. But it was a courtyard, an atrium, if we call it, and it had beautifully painted frescoes along the walls. And in many of these villas, you have a succession of frescoes over many decades. And by the way, there was an earthquake here in this coast in 62 AD, so a few years before the volcanic eruption. And many of these villas were being still reconstructed or rebuilt in part in 79 when the volcanic eruption happened, and they were covered in ash. But here you can see that the courtyard is virtually intact, at least down at the lower levels, with the frescoes, the mosaics on the floor. This is the water basin that stood in the center of this atrium. The columns are almost entirely there. You can see that they were made of brick and then covered in plaster, looking like, and painted in some cases, and in faux painting to look like marble itself, with marble capitals, of course, holding the beams of the roof in place. Here's some more details of that internal courtyard with some of the beautiful frescoes. The colors are so rich and vibrant. And of course, fresco means that these pigments were painted on the plaster when it was fresh or when it was wet. And then it dried together, it hardened to form a very hard, smooth, and almost eternal surface. Here's an image of a cyclops sort of leaping around the basin of this atrium room. There's a little room off to the side known as lararium, and this is where the lares, the gods, the family gods, and the ancestors had images, effigies, bust portraits, and candles and offerings and all kinds of food were laid here to venerate the ancestors and the gods who protected this particular aristocratic home. Here is the large basin that I talked about, the piscina, piscina in Italian, and this was a water basin, the water feature. It was in a colonnaded courtyard, so a much larger space, an outdoor space, if you will, with a lawn, and there were a series of plane trees that were planted alongside in regular rows left and right of that pool that overlooked the ocean. So the Romans could actually take shelter underneath the cover, from the sun or the rain underneath the colonnaded area, or they could walk out and even bathe in the pool if they preferred doing that. The mosaics are marvelous, and they are intact here, as you can see in these two photographs, as are the columns of this wonderful courtyard. And there is, in fact, the view out to the ocean from, and again, ignore all the housing that you see there in the center of this image because that wasn't there. What one had from this pool was a view of the ocean beyond. The plane trees themselves did not survive, but the roots did. The plane trees were swept away by the volcanic blast or burned in the fires that spread through here. But the roots were, in fact, protected. And those were also invested. They left air pockets in the ash. And when the excavators removed all those layers, that tons and tons and tons of pumice and ash and stone from these sites, they found these air pockets, which were indeed the remnants, the space, the negative spaces left by those trees. And so here you see, in fact, some of the root systems of a plane tree. This is a modern plane tree that was planted next to it in homage, if you will, to it. This is that courtyard again, and this is an interesting image on the left. It's an opening, a hole, and this is actually the excavators' tunnels that were carved here in the 18th century. The archaeology was in its rudimentary days back then, and one of the things that often happened with these villas is they were penetrated from above. The archaeologists would then drop down into cavities, open spaces, and once they found walls, they would excavate along the sides of those walls and sometimes punch through the walls to enter other spaces. So this is how this courtyard was actually entered, by literally hammering through the walls that the ancient walls themselves. And there's an opening which they've left as evidence of early archaeology at the site. One of the things that those early archaeologists did was to remove interesting details from the frescoes, the paintings on the walls. So here, for example, on the left, you see large holes in white plaster that were cut open by archaeologists in the 18th century because they wanted the paintings, these little details that you see here, the bird and the deer, for example, here down in the lower left, the standing figure. And what modern archaeologists have done is they've replaced reproductions of those today. The actual paintings themselves are now in the Archaeological Museum in Naples, and you can see them on the walls, framed in wood frames like paintings. But remember, these are details cut out of the walls of the villas in Pompeii, as well as Herculaneum, and these maritime villas along the bay proper. The image that you see there on the right comes from Stabia, and that actually shows you what some of these villas may have looked like in antiquity. Actually, what they probably looked like. Many of them had second stories, which are now gone. Lots of colonnades, docks, wharves, access to the sea, which of course is why they were there in the first place. Here are some more images from this villa in Stabia. Images of gods and goddesses all over the villas. Small details like the ones that you see here on the left really show you the wealth and the sumptuousness of these villas in ancient days. Here's an image of Hermes on the left, or Mercury, and another goddess on the right. Some more with the reproductions now in place, replacing the ones that were removed to the Archaeological Museum in Naples in the 19th century. All those images became part of the royal collections and eventually passed on to institutions like the Archaeological Museum. So in some ways, the picture is complete. You have to visit the museum to see the goods that were taken from here. Here's some more details of those beautiful paintings. And of course, the Romans celebrated these artists who painted these, often calling them Greeks because they had the talents to paint quite naturalistically. And here's that amazing view of the pool, now looking in the opposite direction. So we're looking away from the sea, and not all of it has been excavated. In fact, the end point sits below a medieval structure, which is the building that you see there. And so more than likely, until that building is pulled down, or it may never be pulled down, it may have to be supported somehow, we will never really know what the end point of that pool was like. Except we do know that there was an nymphaeum there. And an nymphaeum is in fact a shrine, if you will, to the nymphs, to particularly water nymphs. So this is the end point of the pool, at least as archaeologists today hypothesize that it looked, because again, it hasn't been fully excavated. But the end point may have had beautiful mosaics like you see here. And here are the details that have been excavated. So we see, in fact, painted frescoes below, and then plaster reliefs in these niches, and then columns up above. So these are remnants, rather shattered remnants, but it gives you a sense of how sumptuous the end point of the nymphaeum was, this pool was, for this Roman household. There's an image of a deity here. More than likely, it's Neptune or Poseidon, the god, and a goddess here on the left, in fragments, of course. And we can go to Pompeii to see what those plaster reliefs may have actually looked like. And there are some wonderful images. This is an image of Zeus, the great god, at one of the buildings in Pompeii, one of the baths in Pompeii. So this idea of associating gods with baths and pleasure and that sort of thing was not uncommon in these aristocratic homes. We're going to look at another villa. This is known as the Villa Arianna, also in Stabia. So let's go take a look at that one. And this is, in fact, the Google map showing you where that Villa Arianna is. Another amazing villa that has been excavated. And this one was excavated between 1757 to 62. Another very, very large villa. It may have been as big as 11,000 square meters. So it was a very, very large villa, almost as large as the Villa San Marco. And here is some a rendering of its plan, at least the parts that have been excavated. It takes its name, Villa Arianna, from Arianna, and Arianna is Ariadne in English. And there is, in fact, a wonderful fresco in a large dining hall inside this villa of Arianna. And it's a typical composition. It's a familiar composition that we've seen in other many places. It's the story of Ariadne, who is on the island of Naxos. And so here she is, sort of in rest in exile at on the island of Naxos, being visited by a number of gods. And so it's a scene, a quite common scene, and there is a beautiful version of it here painted on the walls of this triclinium, or this dining room inside the house. The house is also beautifully, beautifully appointed with these wonderful, delicate paintings and mosaics as well. So we see the mosaics on the floor, similar style to what we saw in the Villa San Marco, just up the road in Stabia. But these little frescoes, when they were excavated, created a whole rage in Western Europe, particularly in interior design. And so I'm just showing you the work of Robert Adam, the English architect. And this is a room inside a house, an aristocratic home in Osterley Park, Middlesex, England, where this style, which was called Pompeian, sort of a generic term for it, even though it comes from Stabia, and particularly from this villa, this style then became the rage in interior design in the 18th, late 18th, and early 19th centuries. Here are the mosaic floors. Fabulous work, and small chips or tesserae pieced together to form very delicate patterns to create a kind of clean, smooth surface for the flooring of these aristocratic homes. Here are some more details of the floors. In most cases, they're pretty dusty today, but every now and then when water falls on them and puddles form, you can actually see the original coloring, the vibrancy of the coloring. Black and white marbles used to form. Here's an atrium with an impluvium, or a pool, in this Villa Arianna. And more details of the exquisite paintings in a number of different styles. And the styles of painting have been named first, second, third, fourth, because they vary over the course of a few centuries. And in some homes, we see actually all of these styles together, showing you that they were renovated or expanded during the historic period. Here's some more beautiful details from this villa. These are now in Naples because they were removed from the original walls, showing you a number of goddesses. On the right, we have the goddess Diana or Artemis. And here's some of the vibrant coloring of some of the frescoes. These are actually in service areas of the house. Ignore the column on the right. That's a support structure for a new roof that protects these ancient walls and ancient frescoes and mosaics. I want to go now to the site of Oplontis, not far from Stabia, and there is a marvelous villa. It's known as the Villa Poppaea, and here are some images of that villa. And by the way, not only has the villa been excavated in good part in the 20th century, but its gardens have also been recreated based on what was discovered when those were excavated as well. And here you see a marvelous rendering. It also had water basins like you see here, and courtyards, rooms surrounding these courtyards, often laid out in a very regular rectilineal pattern, atria and that sort of thing as well. And it also has exquisite floors, exquisite frescoes, and more importantly, a number of magnificent pieces of sculpture, particularly outdoor sculpture, that were excavated at this site. We're going to take a look at that. And here you see how regular the plans are. And again, what you have are rooms that surround these atria, and these rooms, of course, are all sheltered by roofs, but the atria themselves are open to the sky above. And here's another, this is an aerial view with the modern city around it. And again, this is the modern street level up here where the tree line is. And then you have to excavate down below. In some cases, as deep as 30 or 40 feet to get to the original firmament, the original ground level. It's kind of a shame to see structures like these surrounding these beautiful ancient sites. And then, of course, this villa had fabulous gardens, and we're going to see evidence of those as well, and laid out in geometric patterns like you see here. So at the heart of the house was, in fact, this entryway that you see here, this marvelous entryway. It had a triangular pediment, a portico, if you will, of columns, and then it was surrounded by colonnades left and right of it. And of course, on the right, now we face this hard wall that tells us, though, that the area continued and it just hasn't been excavated. The modern city sits on top of that fill. Okay, the villa is named after Poppaea Sabina, possibly the wife of Emperor Nero, because of an inscription that was found at the site. And this is a bust portrait of Nero's wife, Sabina, Poppaea Sabina. However, the name Poppaea was a common name, and so it's not entirely clear that the aristocratic woman we're talking about here is the Empress Nero's wife. And here is again that right flank of the house in the courtyard, showing you the deposits of ash that were excavated here on the left in order for us to engage the past directly, to see the remnants, the columns, the gardens of the ancient villa. Here's some more views of that colonnade, and it follows a similar pattern. So we've seen this at the Villa San Marco, the Villa Arianna, those sites in Stabia. And here are some of the sculptures that were in the gardens of this villa as it was being excavated. I'm just going to show you some of those, and they are actually quite fine. They are mostly copies, they're Roman copies of ancient Greek or Hellenistic sculptures. So they're famous sculptures that may have existed originally in bronze, but now were replicated in marble, in some cases in large number, by Roman sculptors in the first century BC and the first century AD, so before the Common Era, the turn of the Common Era. Here are some more sculptures from this Villa Poppaea at Oplontis. Centaurs, the similar kinds of themes that we saw in the frescoes in Stabia. In some cases, quite delicate and lovely sculptures. These may have come from the Lararia, the places where the gods, the statues of the gods and the ancestors were kept, or kept in other parts of the villa proper. So I've shown you outdoor as well as indoor sculptures. These are actually quite small sculptures of the goddess Aphrodite or Venus on the left and Dionysus on the right. And again, just as we had in Stabia, we can see these marvelous gardens recreated at Oplontis. And here is, in fact, the remnant of an ancient olive tree, and a modern olive tree planted there at the foot of the remnants, or the cast, if you will, of its ancient ancestor. The frescoes here are marvelous. And again, we have a range of styles, architectural styles, but these frescoes actually show us these fictional architectural spaces, in some cases, fictional columns, faux columns, if you want to use the French term. But sometimes they're marvelous three-dimensional views into alternate rooms that don't really exist. So doorways, stairs, steps that lead into fictional or painted spaces. Beautiful, beautiful places. This is the impluvium of this very large atrium inside the villa at Oplontis, the Villa Poppaea. And again, it gives you a sense of, I mean, there's a good argument for this being a royal villa and identifying it with Nero, the rule of Nero. These are the kinds of frescoes that we also see at Nero's Golden Palace in Rome. Here we see them in this villa in the outlying parts of the region. Here's another room, much of it fragmentary, as you can see, but it gives us a sense of how sumptuous these spaces were in their day when they were intact. We also have magnificent castings. The wood of the doors and windows is gone, but they left air pockets in the ash, which hardened around them. And so when they were invested or filled with plaster, then you could carve the ash up to that plaster and then release the plaster to show us, in fact, what those doors and windows, those organic materials, which are now gone, actually look like. So these are the shadows, if you will, or the casts of the doors of the house itself. It's really marvelous. Iron fixtures, metal fixtures survived, but not the wood proper. That was burnt up but it left its impression there. So the impressions are what we have now in plaster of the house. But the frescoes themselves did survive, and they are marvelous. In the servants' quarters, for example, we see these faux marble patterns painted on the walls. They're painted in fresco. Here's some more details of the exquisite frescoes with their naturalistic images of birds and urns and that sort of thing. There are these small rooms, vividaria, these little tiny courtyards where you had plants and sometimes fountains and sculptures with lovely paintings of the gardens themselves. So here's an image of one of these vividarium, a vividarium with plants, birds, and fountains. These are beloved themes of Roman painters. Here's a very, very fancy fountain with a sphinx or a harpy holding up a fountain, supporting a fountain. A peacock sitting on the edge, taking a sip from a fountain. Birds alighting on the edges of an urn that also doubled as a fountain. And in fact, those urns were found at the villa at Oplotis. There's another neighboring villa, and this is a commercial or working villa that was discovered not far away, some 300 meters from the Villa Arianna, a two-story place, and many victims were also found here, taking shelter from the volcanic ash. And many of them with their goods. They had bags of jewelry and money, so they were clearly fleeing the volcanic eruption. And so it's rich in sort of the social history. This particular villa, this site doesn't have a name, just has a letter as a letter designation, but it was actually a working villa. This was actually a place where wine was distributed, stored, and distributed. So we have lots and lots of these wonderful vessels that were used to store the wine at this particular villa. I want to take you lastly to the site of Bosco Reale and show you some of the spaces, the marvelous spaces that were excavated there. This is a room, a singular room that was excavated at the villa of Publius Fannius Sinistor in Bosco Reale. And this room has been lovingly recreated at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. You can see its original mosaic floors and the fresco paintings, and then the modern restorers have built a vault over it, which is not original, but it in fact gives us a sense of what might have covered this space. And the furnishings, by the way, are also reconstruction, so you can ignore those. But it gives you a sense of what this sleeping room, this cubiculum, might have been like in antiquity. And here are the lovely and fabulous paintings, details of those paintings that surround the space. Here's another view of it. And the archaeologists or the reconstructors have sometimes changed their minds about the color of the ceiling and that sort of thing, because again, we don't have this actual element. What we have are the frescoes from the walls and the mosaic from the floors. Here's some more details of the kind of fictional architecture that you see in those paintings. Here's, for example, a circular temple of Tholos in Greek. Here's a cave, and again, urns and sometimes offerings, flowers, fruits, garlands, shields, that sort of thing. Images, effigies of gods and goddesses in miniature surrounding or populating these fictional painted spaces. And this is an image of that site, that villa as it was when it was excavated around the year 1900. Actually, some people think that this site was actually plundered because it wasn't legally excavated. But here is in fact the site, and this is another detail, another fragment at the Metropolitan Museum of Art showing us a woman playing a musical instrument, a Roman matron, if you will, with a child or an attendant, maybe a servant, sitting right behind her or standing behind her as she plays the kithara, this ancient instrument. There's another villa at Bosco Reale that was also excavated, if you want to call it that, in the around 1900. This is the Villa Pisanello or Pisanella, and this is one of the treasures, if you will. This is in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and it shows you some of the silverware that was excavated at the house. This is a fabulous drinking cup with all these skeletons to show us that the Romans actually delighted in and embraced death as well as a part of the life cycle. So gods and goddesses, this is an image of Leda and the swan. So this is Zeus as a swan. Images of from the Greco-Roman myths in this treasury from the Villa of Pisanella. Okay, and also at Bosco Reale there is the Villa Regina, and this is also a very interesting villa because this is not an aristocratic villa. This is what is known as the Villa Rustica, or a rustic villa. This is a country home from a working farm, and this was imagine these farms, many of them surrounded by olive groves or vineyards. This one in particular was surrounded by vineyards. And this is what is known, this villa, actually this series of farm buildings had two very important details: a torcolarium, which was a wine press, and also vessels, underground storage vessels, large vessels known as the doli, where the wine was actually stored. And that's what you see in the diagram in the upper left. These structures are actually buried earthen pots, very large earthen pots to store large quantities of wine, and then the series of rooms surrounding it where these winemaking activities could take place. Here's the villa in black and white. It's a little bit clearer to see. And again, this is the modern ground level up here with modern apartment blocks surrounding it. But if you excavate down, you go down to the original level of the ground. And again, the building surrounds a series of courtyards, open air courtyards for the workmen to work, but it had closed, sealed rooms to protect the wine. On the grounds is a very interesting detail, and that is this very revelatory tree. What you see is the trunk of a tree, and again, we're looking at the plaster cast of a tree that is now gone. But when the excavators excavated the ash away, they found this cavity which was invested with plaster. And what this shows you is the direction of what is known as the pyroclastic flux. That is this enormous blast of hot, extremely hot air and gas that flowed from the volcano in the direction that you see here. And that was as much as 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in temperature. So it burned, it scalded everything in its direction, bending this tree over. It might have been a large palm tree. And it gives us a sense of the surge. So actually in this site, there's a wonderful diagram where you can see the original ashfall and the various layers of ashfall that covered this area. And then this marvelous testament to that pyroclastic blast that went through here as well. So I'm just going to show you how that blast took place and how volcanologists have sort of systematized what a volcano like this, what an eruption like this might have looked like. Initially, there was the fall of what the Italians call pioggia di pomici bianche, that is white pumice. So we had ash that was coming down and small bits and pieces of pumice that hardened on its way down from the cloud. And this is known as white pumice. Followed by gray pumice, which is heavier, darker, denser. And then that, of course, and that could be as large as, large blocks and bricks. And of course, that's what shattered many of the roofs in these villas and buildings. And then finally, what you have are these pyroclastic surges or blasts. So these are, in fact, waves of hot gases that flow at ground level, and those were really what obliterated many of these sites. So here on the left, you have that early white ash and then the grayer levels above, and those layers can actually be teased out, can be seen quite clearly in sites along the shore. And this is a view of this wonderful rustic villa at Bosco Reale with its doli here in the winemaking areas, wine storing areas surrounding it. There is the courtyard with the doli, and again, these large pots are where the wine was stored, and they are underground. So they're embedded here in the earth itself. And that, of course, kept the wine cool and fresh so that it could be, in fact, drunk at later times. Okay, and if you go to the antiquarium or the museum at Bosco Reale, which it's a marvelous museum, which has lots and lots of the archaeological finds from not just that Villa Rustica, which is on the grounds, but also neighboring sites in Bosco Reale, you can see lots of the everyday life of the Romans as manifested by their objects, the things that they used in day to day. So here are a various number of craters and an amphora, vessels that were used to drink and store liquids like wine, oil, etc. Water. Here's a diagram from the Villa Rustica showing us how these vessels were found when in fact the buildings collapsed under the weight of the volcanic materials. And some of the very interesting objects that also came from the house. For example, here's a scythe, or sickle, to use another name. This is a bread loaf, a typical Roman bread loaf, an image of a god, probably from the Lararium, because this house, this rustic villa also had a shrine to the gods. And this wonderful cast and some of the remains of this poor, unfortunate piggy, this pig that met its demise in the eruption itself. And on that note, we will end our discussion. And then our next lecture, we will turn back to the imperial continuum. And so we will look at the rise of the Trajanic, or the House of Trajan, in our next session. Thank you, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Take care.